Good evening, everyone. I see people starting to log in. We'll just give it a couple of seconds for people to settle in and be able to see our screen. We have 89 registered attendees tonight, so thank you everybody for joining us. To the panel, to Pierre-Alain, Kinga, Rolif, thank you very much. So most of you know me already. I'm Wayne from Focus Core, Director of the Supply Chain Desk. Tonight we will cover Pharma post-COVID-19 and discuss 3 different points of view. So I hope this will be valuable and we'll have meaningful discussions afterward. So for introduction, first of all, tonight we have Pierre-Alain Guillon, Representative Director and Country Manager at World Courier Japan. Pierre-Alain is experienced executive, combining both large multinational structural approach and entrepreneurial experience in the healthcare and life science space. He's passionate about patients and how best serve them. His industry specialization is healthcare, pharma, and operation. Second, we have Ms. Kinga Bersi, Director, Strategic Account and Pricing at SkyCell AG. And Kinga is joining us today from Switzerland, so it's just before noon. Thank you for joining us, Kinga. Accomplished Global Key Account and Logistics Manager with an international background and passion to achieve customer satisfaction. Over 15 years experience in logistics, transportation, and pharmaceutical shipping solutions. Both on the production and the logistics provider side, lived and worked in 4 different countries and managed regional and global business and teams. Last but not least, Rolif Cornelio, Head of Supply Chain Japan JPAC region from Sanofi Japan. Rolif is Head of Supply Chain Japan region at Sanofi, managing pharma and consumer healthcare based on Tokyo. Before Japan, he has experience working in Singapore, Canada, and the US in pharma and consumer healthcare companies. Without further ado, Pierre-Alain, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne. Let me share my screen. I will go into presentation mode and share my screen. All right. Can I confirm that the team can see my screen? Yes? Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. My name is Pierre-Alain Guillon. I am the Country Manager and Representative Director for World Courier in Japan. World Courier, for the few of you or some of the members who may not know who we are, is a specialty logistic provider focusing on the pharma and the clinical trials industry. We are a part of AmerisourceBergen. AmerisourceBergen is the 10th largest company in the US, and we are dedicated to healthcare and pharmaceuticals. As the country manager of World Courier Japan, I would like to say we're quite fortunate to be in a unique position. We're at the conjunction of supply chain on one side and the healthcare and the pharma industry on the other side. So that gives us maybe a very peculiar view on the topic today. The topic today that I would like to discuss is fairly simple. How did the crisis that we're all experiencing, how did it affect the biopharma supply chain industry? And we'll focus mostly on Japan for this next 10, 15 minutes. The coronavirus crisis changed the way we work, it changed the way we live, it did disrupt our projects, and it started very abruptly. And the first thing we saw, the very first thing we saw, end of January, early February, when countries started to react one after the other to the crisis was a very strong focus on border restriction and air freight availability. I mean, we started seeing borders closing, countries going on full supply chain lockdown. And this was one of the most, that was the number 1, 2, and 3 issue on everybody's mind. I mean, how do we make sure that life-saving medication goes to the patient? How do I make sure that my drugs, my investigative products, how do I ensure that their integrity is respected? How do I ensure that they get there on time and that they don't spoil in the meantime? How do I ensure that temperature control is respected? And we're combining that with a very drastic increase of costs for air freight as well. And as a result of those worries, we saw in a matter of days, 5 times, 10 times volume of communication, rapidly increasing volume of communication with the government, volume of communication with the clients, with the suppliers, with the vendors, with the partners, everybody trying to understand what they can and cannot do. After the first wave passed, and after the industry had time to reflect a little on what just happened, we did ask about 150 professionals in Japan in the healthcare, clinical trials, and pharmaceutical industry, what was their view on how the crisis impacted them. And we asked them 3 very basic questions. So first, did your plans change? And interestingly enough, more than 2/3 told us that actually no, the plan had not changed on their side. And about 1/4 of them told us that yes, they started prioritizing products a little. The second question, though, was complementing the first one. So your plans have not changed, but what are you worried about? And this confirmed what we just saw in the previous slide. Integrity of my product, how do I manage temperature control? How do I manage turnaround time? How do I schedule those shipments? But also around country regulations. I mean, country regulation was changing daily, and nobody had any idea about where it would stop. So that was very high on people's mind. But that also led us to the third question, which was, with everything that is happening, how do we make this more robust, and how do we bring the industry closer to the patient? Have the pharmaceutical companies considered bringing trials, in our case, to the patient's home? And the answer was very interesting. 40% of the respondents, of those professionals, told us that yes, they already started bringing healthcare into the patient's home. And another 35% told us that they haven't started in Japan, but they are preparing, they are planning to get started. And only 1/4 told us that they were not preparing for it. So this was what those professionals told us. Now, next to that, we try to compare it with what we saw ourselves and whether it was matching those responses. Now, what we saw was very close to those responses. We did see that there was a fair amount of prioritization in the product. Life-saving products were strongly prioritized. Cell and gene therapy was strongly prioritized. And anything which was seen as not having an immediate impact on the patient was deprioritized. Phase 4 samples, for example. All of those biosample shipments which had very limited immediate impact on the patients were deprioritized. That was the first point. What we also saw is that many of our clients put their efforts onto continuing the projects that had been started, but for those which had not been started or which were in their infancy, those projects were either canceled or delayed. And that was a very strong push from the client side. And the third thing that we saw was an extremely strong rise in Japan on patient-centric services. There was a very strong will to, number one, beds, number two, free up clinical resources, I mean, healthcare resources, which are very valuable, and number three, to protect those patients who were extremely vulnerable by bringing healthcare and clinical trials, in our case, into the patient's home. And PMDA, the Japanese authorities, did strongly help the sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies, to go down that path by making it easy to switch running protocols to direct to patient, by making it easy to delay some of the documentation that was required. So that was what we saw. Now, we talked a little bit about direct to patient, which is maybe a new concept for some of you. Now, direct to patient or patient-centric services, the entire concept is to bring healthcare and pharmaceutical processes, clinical trials from a clinical setting into the patient's home. Japan is a country which is traditionally doctor-centric. And we saw that during this crisis, Japan caught on the global trend of patient centricity, bringing those processes into the patient's home. So direct to patient, bringing investigative products, drugs, ancillaries from a central location into the patient's home, instead of asking the patient to go to the hospital. And direct from patient, where you would take biological samples or unused medications, or even data from the patient home into a central location, a lab, for example. Now, that is assuming that the basic processes are robust enough to ensure the integrity of GCP. That we also need to make sure that all of those processes and IT systems are robust enough to handle data integrity, data handling in general needs to be ready, especially if you think of the case of blinded trials and double-blinded trials. But what we've seen is, because it's been a couple of years, I mean, the crisis did help in pushing for that service, which was in a ready state and which is now shining. What this crisis taught us is that there are a couple of myths that have been busted. The first myth that was present is that a crisis, when people were planning for a crisis, it was planned with the assumption that it would be lasting for a couple of days and it would be very local, that you could ask your brother or sister office for help. And that is not the case. When we plan for crisis, we need to assume it will last for a long time, and that we cannot hope that our brother and sister offices can help, because they will be in the same situation. The second learning there was the belief that in supply chain and logistics in general, you want to be mostly cost optimized. And that's your key priorities. You need to have one partner on which you're going to have the best deal. And that one partner is going to use just a couple of carriers, because that's also where you're going to be the most cost optimized. But actually, there needs to be a balance between cost optimization, but also flexibility and robustness. The first myth that was very present in Japan is that medical care needs to be in a clinical setting. That in 2020, the industry is ready to bring medical care, to bring clinical trial processes into the patient's home to a certain extent. And that was an eye-opener for a lot of professionals in the industry. And the last myth was that BCP, contingency planning, was traditionally a quality exercise that leadership rarely looks at, and that is never put in practice. And what we learned is that the most successful companies were those who could switch on to their business contingency plans like this overnight, that had trained on it, where leadership was familiar with it, and had practiced many times. So if I were to summarize the learnings from this crisis, from our perspective, that would be that number one, when we have a very large project, especially when you have patients at the end of your projects, when you can impact lives, we need to plan for risks which are not localized in nature and which are possibly lasting for quarters, possibly years. We need to plan for disruption. And the second learning is that whenever possible, bringing many of the clinical processes or clinical trial processes and healthcare processes into the patient's home is extremely robust, and it's safer for the most vulnerable populations. And the third learnings that we had was that being flexible and being visible in everything we do in supply chain is key to success. That allows the leadership team to take decisions and to help their shareholders, but also the patients in the best way possible. That concludes my presentation for today. I would like to thank you all for listening. If there is any question, Wayne,
there was
feel free to address.
That was asked from to the panels prior to the event tonight, and you mentioned the MDA made it very easy for you to do direct to patient and delayed documents and really facilitated thing. What about on the custom side? Was that also an easy task? Were they as facilitating?
You mean with regards to just direct to patients or in general?
Well, both maybe.
Okay, so for direct to patients, there are typically very little problems for customs. The only issue that we will need to consider is for double-blinded trials or blinded trials, when you take a sample, a biosample, let's say, from a patient in Japan, and you need to send it to a lab in Singapore, and you need to explain to customs that you cannot show the shipper. So obviously, the custom officers, they want to ensure that you have a proper consignee. So in that case, yes, the customs were very receptive to having the sponsor shipping on behalf, being the shipper on behalf. So that portion was fairly easy. Now, when it came to actual import and export of other products, we did not see a lot of improvements or in the processes, let's say. I'm sure that many of the attendees will have tried to import, for example, something as simple as an alcoholic solution, alcoholic gel. and will have experienced the difficulties of importing or exporting those products. So we did not see a very large improvement on that front. When it had a direct impact on patients, yes.
That's good.
But unless you could link it very clearly to a patient's life, was very difficult.
Thank you very much for precising that. Now I would like to bring it over to Kinga, please.
Thank you, Wayne. Let me share my slides. Okay, can you please confirm that you can see it? Good. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining the webinar today. And Wayne, thanks a lot for the invitation and the opportunity to be presenting here today. What I would like to talk about today is basically how we at SkyCell think about setting up a supply chain. And this is absolutely data-driven decision-making. So we find it very important to make sure that all the data and information is available and you make an educated decision based on this data. But how does it happen? Let me just start with a quick introduction about SkyCell, because maybe some of you have not heard about us before. So we are an award-winning temperature-controlled container solution, providing hybrid containers for the pharmaceutical air freight transportation. A couple of highlights about SkyCell is that we have a market-leading audited performance of a less than 0.1% temperature deviation. We are very much focusing on environmental conscious solutions, so you can achieve up to 50% CO2 reductions by using our containers. We have a continuously growing capacity. Currently, it's over 22,000 pallet capacity annually. And also what's going to be very important later, so I would like to point out that we have the largest IoT-enabled hybrid container fleet on the market. But let's already move on to the current market situation and all the challenges that we are facing on the market right now. Also, as Pierre-Alain mentioned in his presentation, we have a lot of reduction in the air freight capacity, right? We also have to deal with a lot of new logistics partners. You may not have the same airlines, the same routings available. You may have to look into different packaging solutions. You may have to work with different freight forwarders. So everything which has been set up over the past couple of years and was running smoothly, or at least hopefully smoothly, might be off the table, and you have to look for new solutions. As I mentioned, more transshipments are adding more handling points during the transportation, which comes to, at the end of the day, additional risk. Also the limited storage space or any last minute changes, flight cancellations, bumping your cargo to the next flight. It's all a lot of uncertainty at this moment that we have to deal with. And at the same time, the costs has increased, so we have to pay more for these solutions. And also, as most of you are probably prioritizing only the most important products to be shipped, quite often these are life-saving medications. There's absolutely no room for mistakes. There's no room for temperature deviations. So we all have to make sure that you have a very robust protection and a reliable protection for the cargo if you ever decided to ship during these challenging times. And also, if we touch on the upcoming COVID-19 vaccine a little bit, similar situation, there is no or very limited stability data for this product at this point of time. So again, protection during transportation is absolutely crucial at the moment. Therefore, we can all conclude that planning and quick and flexible reaction is more important than we have ever seen on the market. But I told you, right, that we would like to go with data-driven decision-making, but how can we actually do that. As I mentioned, we have the largest IoT-enabled container fleet in the air freight industry. What does it mean? All of our containers are equipped with 2 different temperature sensors. One is measuring the inside temperature of the container, and the other one is measuring the outside, the ambient temperature during the whole transportation flow. We started this in 2013 already, so over the last 7 years, we have collected millions and millions of real-life data points, and we set up a tool based on that, which tool is actually allowing us to simulate all of these shipments before even you are executing the shipment door to door, including all the milestones, to see what is going to happen by the time the medication arrives to the consignee. So it's a very powerful lean risk assessment tool because you know how to work with it. But what are the benefits on your end? First of all, when we are talking about implementation, you have a much faster qualification time. It eliminates the lab tests and therefore accelerates and simplifies the implementation. And also during this challenging time, during COVID-19 times, it supports a much faster and an educated decision making. And what I would like to show you today is actually a real example. And I brought here a shipment from Italy to Japan, uplifting from Milano, Malpensa Airport, flying to Osaka. And I would like to show you how this simulation works and what are the best benefits of that. So normally we have a direct flight from Malpensa to Osaka. It's a fairly easy supply chain or transportation flow. It starts from the shipper, so the container would be loaded at the shipper. Here you can see the ambient temperature is 32 degrees. So I created this simulation now with non-temperature controlled trucking. You truck 3 hours to arrive to the airport, and then we have, of course, we have a waiting time at the airport, about 6 hours when the container and the cargo is in a protected environment. Then we have the ramp time, which is again a major exposure on the container and the product. Then the flight, it's a direct flight from Italy to Osaka. It's about 11.5 hours. We can plan with 12 hours. Then ramp time, customs clearance in Osaka, which again is in a controlled environment, and again non-controlled delivery to the consignee. So it looks all really nice and fairly straightforward. As I mentioned to you, we have the 2 sensors. So on this graph, you can see the outside temperature, which I just mentioned before, going up and down between 5 and 35 degrees. The whole transportation takes only 41 hours door to door. And the inside temperature will be between 3 and 5.1 degrees. So there's no temperature excursion. Everything is pretty straightforward, and we are very happy with that. But now COVID happens, and this flight is not operating anymore. It's not on the market. So even though you were very happy with your supply chain before, you don't have this solution. So you have to look for alternatives. And one of the alternatives that you have here is to go through Munich. In this case, you would have a road feeder service, which is an additional 7 hours trucking from Italy to Munich. And then the actual flight time from Munich to Osaka is pretty much the same as we had from Milano direct. So it's about 12 hours flight. But you have an extra 7 hours trucking, and you have additional handling points, right? Because there is another transit port. So how does it impact your shipment? If you were to choose this solution, then we can simulate this for you again, and then you would see the following graph. What we can state here, that you have an additional 13 hours with the trucking and with the additional handling. the exposure of the container is still between 5 and 38 degrees, and the inside temperature will not change. So it's a very, very easy shipment still. And as you can see on the green line, which is very important here, and I'm just showing it on the presentation on this slide, this is the energy level of the container, which means that how much of the total capacity of the container has been used on the door-to-door shipment. So here we can see it's still over 75%. So we only used a quarter of the container's full capacity. So we are absolutely fine. So you might be actually open to look into other options. Maybe you have a better offer, maybe you have a better pricing through another routing, which puts more challenge from a temperature protection perspective, but financially it might make more sense. So let's look into still the same shipment, but now with a different setup. So in this case, we are looking into an option going through Dubai. Now, what is the challenge that we have in Dubai? We have an additional flight. We are not talking about an additional trucking. We actually have 2 flights. And that means that we are doubling also the ramp time. We are increasing the actual flight time with 6 hours. We have additional ramp times in Dubai, which is also very important to mention because it's about like 65. It can go up to 65 degrees on the ramp. As you can see, this is also in our simulation here. And again, the farther handling points as we had before. Now, how does our simulation look like? We have the transit time increased with 21 hours now. So instead of the original 41, now our door-to-door shipment goes to 62 hours. As you can see, there are significant peaks in the external temperature. So it goes between 5 to 65 degrees. The internal temperature, though, has not changed significantly. It just went up with 0.2 degrees, so the maximum is still 5.3 degrees. What you can observe here is that because of this additional exposure, the container used a little bit more energy, and then at the end of the transportation, we are around 60 to 63% energy level, so we are still absolutely fine. But to look into the situation, what happens when all goes wrong, because we can't be sure that everything is going fine. Let's assume that there's some unforeseen challenges coming up in Osaka, and there's no cold storage. Maybe there is a strike, maybe there is any kind of issue that we cannot predict at this point of time, and that means that the container will not go into the cold storage, and the customs process takes 48 hours. So compared to the average 12 hours, it's been 4 times longer, and the container and the product is not protected during this time. So if this happens, then again, you can just reach out to us, and then we will create the simulation to check what's happening to the container. And that would mean here, you see, we are going up to 98 hours transportation. So we have 57 hours, more than double the door-to-door transportation time that we originally had. The exposure of the container is significantly longer because we have added 2 more days here when there is no protection. But you still have the peace of mind because you can see that the maximum temperature, which is inside the container, is 6.2 degrees. So we still don't have to worry about temperature excursion. Now, here comes the most important point, what I would like to share with you. The reason why we are doing this is to actually detect what's happening. Here, the container used a lot more energy. We are still comfortable with this. But if there would be more exposure, or if we would want to be 100% on the safe side, then we could make an educated decision at this point to change the non-temperature controlled truck either on the origin or on the destination side or on both cases. And then with changing the supply chain, you are increasing the protection of your product. And that's the important, to always look into data, to look into all of the available information. And based on that, you will be able to select the most cost competitive and most secure solution on the market. And how we use this is always a close cooperation between the pharma shippers, freight forwarders, and SkyCell, because together with a good cooperation, we can ensure that you have the best solution available on the market. So that was it from my side, Wayne. So if there's any questions to me, I'm absolutely happy to answer those.
Thank you very much, Kinga. Prior to the event, again, from the attendees, you mentioned one of your challenge that caused by COVID-19 was, having to deal with canceled flight or changing the folder. But as those challenges also created new opportunities for you or in the supply chain?
Absolutely. As I said, we always encourage all of our customers and all of our partners to go for this data-driven, educated decision-making. And there were quite a lot of times when our partners with whom we were not necessarily working a lot before approached us, and we had the opportunity to actually cooperate, and with this collaboration work out a really competitive solution and a safe, secure, and sustainable supply chain.
So it created new relationship, new.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to questions after. To
Perfect,
move on, last but not least, Rolif, please take it over.
Thank you, Wayne. Can you hear me clearly, Wayne?
Very clearly.
Fantastic. Hi, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you're joining from. My name is Rolif Cornelio, and we've heard so far from Pierre Alain on direct-to-patient shipments, from Kinga on freight, and optimizing it, especially on cold chain. I'd like to share with you a bit now from the manufacturing perspective. What is the impact of COVID on pharma supply chains, and how I think the macro view would be in terms of the impact going forward. Before I start, maybe a quick Dilbert is probably a good way to get our juices running high. I'll let you quickly read through this. So allow me today to share a few of my hallucinations about the future. And I'll of course try to pretend that they are useful, and we don't know what the future holds, but we can only try to predict the best we can. The agenda for today is quite simple. So I'll share with you a bit about Sanofi. What are the challenges highlighted by COVID? And then what are the future trends that I can project? And then can we apply the case of COVID-19 vaccines to it? Sanofi is a global pharma company present in about 100 countries, distributing to 170 countries, 73 manufacturing sites. So a big enterprise operating in 4 different business units, BUs. The first one is specialty care. So this is about very specific treatments to a small number of patients. The second one is what we call general medicines. So these are large volume patients like diabetes and cardiovascular. If you might have heard during the April and May months about a medicine called hydroxychloroquine. So this is sold by Sanofi under the general medicine portfolio. Our third category is vaccines, and Sanofi vaccines business is also known as Sanofi Pasteur, and Pasteur is one of the oldest vaccines manufacturing. So we have a history of very strong manufacturing experience. And the final pillar we have is consumer healthcare. So this is about over-the-counter medication and allergy, pain, digestive, and nutrition. So we play in all 4 categories. An important point to know about Sanofi is 2/3 of our medicines and vaccines are on the WHO's list of essential medicines. And this is a very critical point when it comes to pharma supply chains. It's okay to be out of stock on toilet paper, you can still survive. It's okay to not have the latest version of an iPhone, but it's not okay when you have somebody's life depending on medication. And that's why it's critical how we manage our supply chains. And especially in the light of COVID, it has highlighted some challenges, which have made it very clear. And let's look at them a little bit and then decide how we can proceed to solve them in the future. The first one is demand distortion. So what I mean by this, let me explain with two concepts. The first one is the vicious loop of uncertainty and variability. As humans, when we face uncertainty, which we cannot control, it of course leads to fear. And this fear then leads to variability. Now, what do I mean by this? It could mean variability in terms of panic buys and hoarding of products, trying to go through unsecured channels and buy products that are not licensed and so on. And when that happens, that variability leads to further uncertainty. And you can see how this loop can continue to feed itself. And especially when you consider this variability from a manufacturing perspective, there is a concept called bullwhip effect, which most of you might know. The graph below shows you a bit in terms of what the demand changes affect right from the retailer through the manufacturer. So the blue line is the fluctuation of demand that the retailer or the pharmacist sees. That then leads to a fluctuation of demand that the wholesaler sees, which then leads to the distributor's end and then finally manufacturer. And as you can imagine, when you're a manufacturer, how do you know what the real demand is? What are you manufacturing for? So when you have so much variability in the supply chain, it distorts the demand very significantly. The second challenge is on the visibility of products. So I explained to you a bit about Sanofi having 73 manufacturing sites, shipping across multiple locations to 170 countries and hundreds of customers in those countries. Each of these nodes have inventory in them, and we have multiple product types. How do we keep track of all the inventory at every node? And not only Sanofi products, but how can we make sure that there are other variants available in the market? Because at the end of the day, we want to prioritize patient life, not necessarily always about supporting Sanofi products. So not having visibility to each node in the network definitely creates a big barrier to be able to allocate inventory correctly and make those right decisions. Specifically in the example of hydroxychloroquine, which I mentioned to you earlier, within weeks of the announcement going that hydroxychloroquine could be a potential solution to COVID-19, we saw immediate purchases from multiple governments and companies to stock up on this inventory. And very quickly we lost visibility to what we had in our network. And it took a lot of exercise to gather all the information and put it together and then consolidate it to make the right decision. And guess what? It changed again the next week. So we were on a continuous cycle of trying to get more and more visibility. The last point I'll share with you is about boundaries and nationalism. And I think we've seen this happen quite a lot during the last few months, and we are still continuing to see this happen now, is that countries are protecting themselves by banning exports of certain pharmaceutical products or PPEs. This graph here from Statista was very visually clear. You can see in red all the countries that banned something during the course of COVID-19 to be exported from the countries. As you can imagine, when we ban certain exports, it just fuels more of that uncertainty and hence leads to more variability. Now, knowing that these are our challenges, what can we do to think about the potential trends of what the future holds? The first one, let me cover is on the demand variability. And I believe that the future here is going to be patient consumption-based forecasting. Today, we track sales based on the sale of the product, the invoicing, but we don't really track how much the patient has consumed the product. Of course, it'll be hard to track how much toilet paper toilet paper people use, but maybe in terms of prescription medicines for certain life-saving products, this might become relevant. Most of you must have seen the latest ad from Apple computers on the iWatch and what are the fantastic things they could do. But it's not far where we could potentially track the patient-based consumption of certain products, which could then lead to the real forecasting of the demand. The next is about end-to-end visibility. As you can imagine, all pharma companies today are along the same journey of trying to find visibility to the entire network. And different companies trying to do it independently may not always find the best solution. So I believe there is space in the market for an independent player to be able to collect all this data and actually collect the data across all companies. Today we track sales data, but we don't really track inventory availability. And if we can have that end-to-end visibility of the inventory in the network, we can certainly drive better decision making. And the last point is on the boundaries. So here I believe that it is only possible for us to move beyond the boundaries of a nation if we can form global consortiums and really look at end patient health rather than patients in my country or my region alone. If we think of these macro trends from the perspective of COVID-19, and let's think about how these might apply to COVID-19. So the first point on consumption-based forecasting. There are multiple COVID-19 vaccines in the market. It's not very clear how many doses are required per vaccination for each patient. At a global level, how do we track which patient has actually got the vaccination and which patient has not? Is this data going to be captured at a country level, at a global level by the WHO, by individual companies? But this will be critical and it will be the first step in moving towards this patient consumption-based forecasting. End-to-end visibility. As we speak today, many countries are signing deals with pharma companies to, let's say, assure certain quantities for their markets. But how do we actually track how much inventory exists in each market? And is that enough for all the patients that exist in the country? Are we overstocking in certain countries while there is a shortage in others? And the last point is on global consortiums. While many countries are trying to protect their national boundaries, it's also very optimistic to see certain groups forming, where recently, if you might have heard, a few pharma companies got together to announce that they will only release the vaccine for sale or for use after they believe there is enough efficacy, so that a country may not force them to actually use an unproved vaccination. Another good example here is of COVAX, which is a joint group at a global level where they are trying to make sure there is a fair and equitable distribution of COVID vaccines to all patients around the world, not only the wealthy nations. Before I close, I'd like to share with you this one quote from the New York Times that was published in March. Coronavirus and its economic and social fallout is a time machine into the future. Changes that many of us predicted would happen over decades are instead taking place in a span of weeks. And while these macro factors that I've shared with you may sound very macro and may sound very distant, the trend of COVID vaccine or the COVID era has been to accelerate many of these changes. So we should expect to see many of them come true soon if any of these predictions are right. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'd like to take them. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Rolif. Before I ask you the question from the attendees, I would encourage people now, we have a few minutes left. So please, in the Q&A section, please start writing your question down for our panelists, and we'll choose from there. Rolif, from previously from the attendees, you mentioned that the bullwhip effect kind of mixed things up quite a lot for you guys and other companies. You also mentioned that in the future, patient demand will be probably where you will want to go. What kind of skills, what kind of experience will people need or will need to develop in these circumstances?
Yeah, so I'll answer this question more restricted to supply chain, because that's where we play. And I think, especially within Japan, I believe that we don't really have a good view of the the end patient level. So pharma companies generally have enough exposure to the wholesale level, and then wholesalers then manage to the hospitals and then to the patients. And I believe that in order for us to really get to that patient level consumption, we will need people having the right skill sets to gather large sets of data related to patient consumption, to analyze those consumptions and then make right recommendations. So I think we're going to see a shift of being able to process orders and make sure it ships to more where we look at consumption of patients and trends on what's happening and recommend like major changes to our ordering and inventory storage and so on.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes. There's a question that I wanted to ask, and I think it's relevant to the three of you. With clinical trials going on COVID-19, with the shortage of air freight capacity, with the temperature control, also I'm sure the capacity is also something that you need to all take care of. In terms of packaging, in terms of global distribution, Pierre-Alain, especially for you guys, I'm sure some patient will not be able to, go get vaccinated maybe at the hospital. In terms of packaging, in terms of distribution, how do you see that look like? Pierre-Alain?
Yes, thank you for the question. So how do we see the distribution of the vaccine from a central location to the endpoint? And your question is around capacity, or is it around processes, or both, maybe?
Probably both, because I mean, in terms of capacity, it will be a question of skilled personnel to be able to administer that vaccine, and also being equipped to safely deliver that vaccine. So how does that work for you?
All right. So let's say that you have lots of vaccine options going on. I mean, some of them requiring very detailed temperature control at very, very low temperature. I will not mention which company, but some very prominent company does have those requirements. Some of them are a lot easier to address. I think less than I don't foresee a major issue in the transportation itself, to be frank, but I see an issue in the storage. And let me explain there. So you have a chain of providers, pharma companies, the CMOs, and then the logistic providers who are fairly used to handling those products. When it comes to having sensitive temperature requirements and sensitive control, I don't think that the endpoint, so the hospitals at this point in time, possibly even the patients' homes, I don't think that there is the capacity and there is sometimes even the know-how to handle such specific requirements in such large volumes in such a short amount of time. So I see that the weak point being towards the patient side. So not so much, once again, on the container, not so much on the providers, the supply chain providers, is more towards the storage in the clinical setting. There will be, I am sure, a push to organize remote settings. I mean, you will have, especially in Japan, an elderly population, and there will be a couple of million people who will want to be vaccinated and who are not able to go to a hospital easily. Right. So there will be a push at some point to allow nurses, appropriate nurses, to go into the patient's home and administer that drug. And there will be a push also to ensure that there is a mobile clinical setting to deliver it. If we need to have assistance from a doctor, it could be telehealth. In most of the vaccines we see, that should be no problem. I do hope it answers your question.
Thank you very much, yes. Kinga, how do you see the problem being addressed?
Yeah, I actually would take a step back already for the mass, transportation from the factories to the different regions and countries. We did a little bit of calculation on what we expect to be added on the market once the vaccine is out and will be distributed. And based on the world population and how we assume that it will be, the doses will be split between ocean, air, and overland transportation, we came to a number which is a little bit over 150,000 pallets, which will have to be distributed. And that's quite a hurdle on the air freight industry as well, to have air freight capacity, to have packaging capacity. Not to mention that at this point, quite a lot of requirements are more in the frozen areas. So we expect for the first couple of months to have a high demand on the frozen solution, and then afterwards rather move to the 2 to 8, like the normal vaccine transportation temperature range. But I would not neglect this volume, which is going to hit the global air freight market. Definitely, there will be challenges, and I can just encourage everyone to start discussions with packaging providers, with airlines, with freight forwarders, to make sure that they are actually prepared for this.
We see on the news, and I don't know if it's being inflated, but they're talking about 8,000, air freight needed. Do you think that's a correct assumption in terms of numbers?
You mean 8,000 new planes?
Yeah.
Actually, yeah. It's if you correlate between the average capacity of a plane and this number of pallets that I just highlighted, then it's probably very close to that.
Thank you.
I'm glad to see we came to the same number.
It's a lot of airplanes.
Indeed.
Rolif, packaging question, but maybe not necessarily on COVID itself, but in terms of vaccine, or because the demand is going to be so big, so quick, and like Pierre-Alain mentioned, maybe storage is going to be an issue. In terms of packaging, is manufacturing working on new technologies or new ways of protecting the vaccines for a longer period of time?
I mean, there are, so from what Pierre-Alain and Kinga mentioned, there are two major variants of this vaccine. Right? One is going to be between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. The other one is going to be around -60 Celsius, which is in the frozen section, right? And I think at this time, there are quite a lot of unknowns in terms of which vaccines will actually be successful. If they're successful, how many doses will they have available at one given time? And once they're available, how much will it be shipped to each market, right? And once it's available in the market, how quickly can we turn around the actual vaccination, right? So, when we think about all the numbers, we have 7 billion population, and let's say, I don't know the number, but maybe we are producing 10 billion vaccines. These are not going to all appear at the same time, right? So there's going to be a phased availability of these vaccines. And I think in my opinion, I think the key here is going to be how quickly can we administer those vaccines, so there's a quick throughput of the volume throughout the chain, rather than holding them in any point in time. And I think from Pierre-Alain's point of view as well, is that's going to be critical in terms of capacity. Is it going to be mobile vaccinations? Is it going to be at-home vaccinations? How can we mobilize that quickly? And then to Kinga's point as well, is I do see there going to be a capacity in the overall flights, and temperature controlled is definitely already a constrained area, which means that having this surge at a certain time will make it more challenging. way. So I don't think there are much more advanced new ways of packaging. I think Kinga and Kaisal is already leading the way. So we will need to bank on partners like them to support the manufacturers in getting the product available.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one last question. I see here in the QA box, it says anonymous, but I think it's a good one with end-to-end visibility. How do you see the planning? How do you see the simulation planning? How do the upcoming massive transportation needed for the vaccination? Who is doing the simulation?
I suppose it's a question for me, right? So we are doing the simulation for our partners. What we usually prefer to have is a connection between the pharma manufacturers and then your selected freight forwarder, because the freight forwarder is the one who is actually designing the door-to-door transport, and they are the ones who can advise us how they are planning to execute the shipment. And then based on these milestones, we can create the simulation for you, and then we are sharing it with our partners. We do that also when there are like first discussions with a client and they would like to better understand how our container would work on some of the more challenging transportation lanes. But this is also something that we always do during the implementation phase of a new lane. So if even if you work with Kaisal already and you have a new lane that we start to cooperate on and you're utilizing our containers, we would do again the lane risk assessment, usually for two different scenarios, the most extreme summer and the most extreme winter scenario, to have a full 360 degree overview on the performance.
Thank you.
Can I just add a point there, Wayne? I think, you know, what I foresee is going to be that there is going to be a need to do this simulation quickly. I think because the situation will evolve every week once we have the vaccine available. It's not going to be, you know, let's discuss it for a few months and see where to allocate it. You know, it's just going to go. And I think in a scenario like that, you know, the tool that Kinga showed is actually exceptionally good, because within minutes we can know what's the available lanes, how do we best ship it, and based on the capacity. I wonder if there is a way to correlate the lead time also with capacity available based on locations, real time. Maybe that could make overall decision making faster in terms of how to get it from point A to point B.
Thank you. Was there any more question that our audience wanted to ask our panelists tonight?
I mean, I see a couple of more questions in the Q&A. Are we gonna have the opportunity to answer those outside of the webinar? Because I'm happy to do so.
If the attendees also wanted to take the discussion offline, please do share the question. They will be shared with Kinga, Pierre, and Rolif. So please do expect a follow-up on the questions. Unless there was any other pressing point tonight, I think we came to a conclusion. We're good? Thank you. Pierre-Alain, merci. Kinga, sorry, in Swiss, I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Rolif, thank you very much also for being with us. Wishing you all a big thank you for coming, and look forward to, you know, upcoming discussions on the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.